got Andrew Barnhill. I've got Andrew Barnhill with me, and we're here today to talk about drug policy in the states. Want to highlight that policymakers are continuing to wrestle with these coverage issues across the country, and the solutions have been wildly divergent. It's easy to just sort of throw up your hands and say we disagree and stop, but if Justice Brandeis said, a single courageous state may serve as a laboratory for novel experiments without risk to the rest of the country. That's something that we need to take a look at. Today, I'm joined in the discussion with Andrew Barnhill, head of policy and chief government affairs officer for IQVIA, the world's largest clinical research organization. He leads the company's engagement with governments, think tanks, international organizations, and Andrew is an award-winning life science government affairs executive. Andrew, thanks for joining us. And by the way, I'm JP Waisky with Horizon Government Affairs. I'm a former state regulator and do policy work here and lobbying on behalf of Horizon and its clients. So Andrew?
Well, thanks so much, JP. I'm really delighted for the invitation to be here, and thanks for that really kind introduction. On behalf of IQVIA, I'm really excited to have this conversation because I think that both the state and federal environments can really learn a lot from each other. At the state level, we see a lot of innovative policy ideas. Some of them are helpful and some of them are harmful, that speak to some of the broader questions that aren't getting addressed here in Washington, and a number of those relate to cost. So look forward to this conversation today.
Great. And Andrew, as you and I have chatted and we look into the states, they're looking at a number of efforts to control drug costs. Sometimes they're focused on consumer issues. Certainly, if you go back to the NEIC's, the model that actually got adopted, Model 22, that's focused on consumers. Other times they're looking at Medicaid issues, and other times employers, and even sometimes their state health plan. I think one of the things that we've seen sort of trending up as an issue in the states is these prescription drug affordability boards. As you know, Horizon just released an infographic on this issue, which we'll send out to folks attending the call later. But the concept comes from a 2017 NASCHIP model, and the idea is it purports to make drugs cheaper and more affordable through theoretically this review process, which ends up being a sort of cost control. What are your thoughts, Andrew?
Yeah, that's correct, JP. There are a couple of key points that I think are worth raising for us about these prescription drug affordability boards, or PDABs. One is that they can decide whether or not a drug is considered affordable by their terms. And that's not just the price. It could depend on insurance reimbursement, whether it treats a condition in an underserved community, and a variety of other factors that the program can decide on. Now, once a drug is determined to be unaffordable, if it is, many of the PDABs have the ability to set the price through what's known as an upper payment limit. And the factors could include what the drug costs in other countries, or a number of different factors that individual state comes up with as they're developing their program.
Yeah, and Andrew, as you look at the process, I think what's sort of interesting about it is they sort of try to push the fact that they're pushing expertise on these boards, and yet nobody who's involved with the drug space at all is allowed to be a member of the board. If you look at sort of other P&T committees, other issues, reviews, typically you're just not allowed to vote on your own drug or your own, where you have a conflict. So this is sort of unique. On top of that, it is a process that oddly is not very well used in states. You certainly see it with power plants. You certainly see it in other sort of monopolies when there's price setting, but you don't see it typically in this sort of space. And I would note that so we've seen 8 states have passed them with varying states levels of control, and from your perspective, as you look across the states, are you seeing lots of introductions of these bills across the country?
Yeah, those are good questions, JP. And first, I'll note back to your earlier point it is concerning that you don't see individuals who are involved with the prescription drug space, people who have biopharma or life sciences backgrounds being involved in part of these discussions. That's always a concern for new government programs when you don't have people who actually understand the industry being involved. So we're certainly have some concerns about that. But to your direct question about the states that passed them so far, let me give a little bit of the landscape of where we are now. So this really started as a conversation around 2016. And since then, state policymakers have thought about a number of different methods to try to reduce spending and cost associated with prescription drugs that the state deems unaffordable in some way for state purchasers and or for patients. And some of the earlier ones that we saw were manufacturer transparency bills, but we've seen a number of different efforts and legislation that sort of fall into this category of drug affordability as the states see it. Increasingly, they have started turning to PBMs to address spending, and some of those have the authority to establish these upper payment limits, or the UPLs. And so in 2023, our most recent year, at least 11 states have considered or are considering this type of legislation. So we're not seeing it everywhere, but we are starting to see that cascade of states that are jumping in. Anybody who focuses on state legislation knows that sometimes you'll start with a trickle, but then once you get a half dozen or a dozen states doing something, it starts to become more of a widespread trend, and you start seeing it pop up across the country. So that's one of the reasons it's worth really talking about now as you look at both the federal and state landscape. So, most states, PBMs comprise state-appointed healthcare experts and some sort of stakeholders. And the traditional ones use some criteria that they've outlined either in statute or in some cases in rulemaking to identify how they're going to evaluate drugs and conduct these affordability reviews to figure out what's meeting their criteria thresholds. And so in the states where they have the authority to set these upper payment limits, the boards can use findings from those affordability reviews to select a specified number of drugs for which to set UPLs, the upper payment limit. So they don't have to do it with every drug. They can sort of narrowly construct a list of ones that they are going to focus on. And so this payment threshold, a UPL, it's typically on all purchases and payments for a selected number of drugs that is set a part of that initiative. And they can consider a variety of criteria when setting those limits. They can consider the WAC, the wholesale acquisition cost. They can consider broader cost to the state. And also they can look at, is this drug perhaps on the drug shortage list at the FDA? All of those things can be factored in to the list that the states put together either through their legislation or through rulemaking. Now, I mentioned how this sort of started in a broader conversation back in 2016 when states started getting interested in drug cost. But the first of these affordability boards was actually not created until 2019 by the Maryland legislature. And, ever since then, we've seen them enacted in a number of states: Maine, New Hampshire, Oregon, Ohio, Washington, Minnesota, and Colorado. In some ways, Colorado is pretty far along with theirs. And out of those 8 that have been signed into law or enacted, 5 of them contain those price limit threshold provisions. And that's Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Maryland, and Minnesota. So those are ones that we look at pretty closely.
And it's interesting. You noted that Maryland was the first one to pass the PBM, and they have long experience with the hospital price setting in Maryland. But they established it in 2019. They ran into problems. There was COVID issues. There's funding issues that attach. So they're actually not as far as long as you would expect, especially given their experience with the hospital pricing board. Colorado seems to be the state that is pushing the envelope the fastest, the quickest. Although, it's important to note when you look at what Colorado is doing, they had an initial push. They had staff guidance to the board. They had to back off some of that guidance because they sort of barred the board from having discussions even with drug companies around drugs and around informational pieces. And they had to back off and indicate that, there are normal free speech sort of pieces that apply here, lobbying pieces that apply. And they've had to go back and actually make some changes this past legislative session to it in order to make it work. And Maryland has continued to have funding issues as well, and are looking at funding sources. Ironically, they're requiring the largely the pharmaceutical industry to pay for this, which is an added expense, increasing drug prices overall, although not to a major degree, certainly. Also note that the model legislation where this seems to come from is NASHP, and there's a very strong interest in a number of other sort of price control issues in the states, including reference-based pricing, international pricing issues. It's just sort of crazy, the sort of price craziness around the price setting that we're talking about in the drug space right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of states are trying to see what they think works, and also to try to demonstrate that they are doing something to address drug pricing. And I think to your point about Maryland having some initial struggles with this, I think there's some states that may start to realize, hey, this may be a little bit more complicated and more nuanced than we thought it was going to be. So one of the things I'm looking at, out of these initial states that have put PBMs into place, how many of them sort of reassess or make changes or tweaks to their programs, a couple of years in?
Well, I think there's also an open question, given that no upper price limit has yet been officially set that is applied to the market at large, as to whether or not those structures are even legal going forward. Are you allowed to sort of set the prices? And especially when you're looking at something that's pretty clearly an interstate commerce issue, outside of a specific state, that you clearly are importing a drug that's manufactured outside the state in most of these cases. So I think there's clearly potential some legal issues around it as well. Let's jump into, I think, a little bit of a data discussion, because part of where the PDAB discussion is coming from, the reference-based pricing that we're talking about, is really around an argument about where drug prices are going in general. And there's a variety of narratives that we're looking at across the country from various advocates on this. You hear insurers say one thing, you hear pharma say another thing, you hear PBMs say something else, you hear consumer groups focus on issues. You've sort of started, IQVIA as a data company has looked into a lot of the discussions. Let me start with sort of a fundamental question that I think we need to answer, and as we look at the policy here, and that is, are drug prices rising? And if they are, how are they rising? And how should we actually measure from a policy perspective what's going on in the drug space, Andrew?
Yeah, all important questions, because I think they kind of force us to get to the root of some of the rhetoric that we're hearing about drug pricing. I've been having debates about drug pricing for over a decade now, and I think we often fail to get to the root about which cost we are actually measuring and saying we are measuring. First of all, a lot of people like to talk about list price. So let's start there for a minute. Over the next 5 years, according to our institute's research, medicine spending will grow between 1% and 4% on a list price basis, and negative to 1% after discounts and rebates. So very small increases when we're talking about list price. Total net spending on medicines 5 years from now, or almost 5 years, 2027, is expected to be unchanged compared to 2022, as some of the volume growth drivers will be fully offset by some of the drivers of lower prices. So, patents expiring, effects of some of this legislation, of course. And growth will be driven largely by adoption of newly launched innovative products, with an average of 50 to 55 new medicines launching per year over the next 5 years, including, or especially those in oncology or with some specialty or orphan drug status. So we're seeing sort of a very small increases when we talk about list price overall, And we're seeing where the growth is these sort of small set of truly innovative products that are typically specialty or orphan products. And so when we think about cost overall, I think it's important to recognize that it is usually a small number of highly innovative products that are driving up the cost of care on the drug side. And by shifting so many of our maintenance meds that we take for things like high blood pressure and cholesterol to generics, the actual cost to the average patient is very different and much lower than the cost of the small subset of patients who are on these highly innovative and, of course, naturally very expensive products. Another factor here I want to take on is that when we say a cost is too high, are we referring to what a manufacturer sets as the price, or what another player in that ecosystem might be charging for the drug? So IQVIA's Institute recently found that hospitals are charging 500% on average of what they pay for medications. And for the 20 medicines that were analyzed, hospitals charged a range of more than 200 to more than 700% of what they paid. And that's confirming a trend that we saw as early as 2018. So my question becomes, is that increased drug cost? Would we call it that? Or is that a hospital upcharge? Would we call it that? So the terms that we use and the way we define the discussion of cost, I think, is significant for us. But if we sort of bracket off that issue, I think we need to be looking at drug pricing through multiple windows as we evaluate what's really happening. So if you're working in a state, I think states should be asking, what can we do to get the patients who live in our states on low-cost generics and biosimilars for those chronic and ongoing conditions and keep them adherent so that state and federal health plans have fewer people needing those more expensive or truly innovative treatments down the road. So those are key things that we think about as we think about cost in general. But the data that we use for measurement, and particularly that states use as you're thinking about these PBMs, is always a question too. I know we'll get to Q&A at the end, but I saw one item pop up, asking, mentioned ICER data, the Harvard Portal Group data that's being used by a number of states. And the respondent was asking, how has IQVIA thought about possibly offering some of our data and services to try to balance out some of what's being considered. And I think that, we can talk about those services later, but I do think it does get to a bigger question about, what are states using to understand drug cost, and how are they leveraging that data that may or may not be available to them? And I think that's a core issue when we have a drug cost and pricing debate at the state level.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Andrew, because the data discussion becomes really complicated at the state level, in part because you're looking at multiple different players. You're obviously looking at a market that reflects a small employer market, an individual market, which is both of which are largely ACA sort of related. You've certainly got a large employer market, which is outside the ACA. You have an ERISA market, which is outside of that. You have Medicaid. You have Medicare to a certain degree in the state, although that's, a lot of that's out of the state control. But you also have a state employee plan. And I would note that when I was with Wisconsin, we had just started getting a data warehouse up and running on the state employee plan to understand what was going on there. And it was a little bit of a unique situation. But states need to be leveraging the data that they have access to. It's interesting to me that a number of the proposals that work through the legislatures actually end up exempting the state employee and local employee, government employee plans, which is where, from a state mandate perspective, a number of legislatures have in fact required them to be on a state employee or local government plan first, so you can understand the cost aspects. But the data seems to be missing. So appreciate, IQVIA sort of bringing some clarity on that front. One of the things that we sort of, that's been difficult to track and curious, in this discussion around prescription drugs, on top of that piece, is we often track prescription drugs sort of separately from medical interventions, right? And we certainly can highlight, there was a study out in the last few weeks claiming that we could save $1 trillion if we got stuff out of the way and more people were inside. More people were able to access hypertension medications as a piece of this. There's other examples, statins and others that sort of end up reducing overall medical costs that are difficult to sort of evaluate. That we focus on preventive care generally and talk about things like mammograms and other things, which are certainly life-saving and catch diseases early, but often forget about medicines treating condition, preventing it from getting worse. So are we, from your perspective, as you guys look at the data over time at IQVIA, are you seeing do you have data and trending that shows we're getting, better value for this, that even though the spending isn't growing, as you sort of highlighted, but the percentage of spending we've got is leading to better health and better overall cost structures for Americans?
Yeah, it raises an important point, JP. And I think one of the challenges or maybe tensions around this is that states have a hard time looking at 10 years from now, 15 years from now, what are we saving, by some more expensive things on the upfront, or sometimes cheaper things on the upfront to avoid more expensive later, because states are looking from budget year to budget year. And so this debate becomes very difficult if you are a government payer. But I do think we should be looking at questions such as, how much can we save by regulating the blood pressure of more Americans and keeping them adherent on hypertension drugs? How many expensive interventions can we prevent having to spend on if we reduce obesity rates through some widespread reimbursement of GLP-1s? Our spending on maintenance drugs for chronic condition gets us significant value, but explaining that when a close lens is placed on annual prescription spending can be pretty hard. And so navigating those things is something we have to do. And I think that's because we spend too much time bifurcating healthcare spend instead of looking at it as part of a broader story about are we getting healthier as a society, or are we getting less healthy?
Yeah, and I think, just to highlight, given, that we're out of, for the most part, the pandemic from the last few years, when we worked on the North Dakota hospital study, I think one of the things that was sort of shocking to think about was the fact that there's no sort of ongoing discussion about public health. That when you look at the incentives for private entities, there is no incentive to sort of focus on public health, either from a local hospital, which is really almost serving, to your point, a monopoly in a particular area. There's no sort of obligation that's sort of attaching there. There is no sort of ongoing discussion about maintaining certain things like early in the pandemic, the ventilators, many of which they had purchased and then realized that they could make more profit someplace else, sold them off, and devoted the space to something else. Certainly a rational economic discussion, but not really optimal as a society. So there are a lot of sort of public health issues that I think attach. And as we continue to look at these and we look at the data and the data discussions, one of the concerns that I've got when you look at the debates inside states and state legislatures is that there are a lot of differences in looking at facts, and the facts are different. And as popularized by Mark Twain, there are lies, damned lies, statistics, right? And so the question is, as we look at these debates, as we look at individual interests, looking at what they're sort of pushing, what are the sort of data points that can be extremely misleading from a public policy perspective?
Love the Mark Twain there, but I do think the data points can feel misleading because each of them are looking at different metrics, yet we all like to think they're looking at drug spending, but we're talking about different things. So sure, drug spending, but what type of spending? In what context? Over 250 new drugs are expected to launch within the next 5 years and contribute over roughly $100 billion in new spending, but that's new drugs. Policy changes, competition between manufacturers, payer pressures, are expected to ensure that the net prices of protected brands decline over the next 5 years and list price growth remains low or stable. Biosim introductions and uptake are expected to save the U.S. healthcare system over $180 billion over the next 5 years, though, of course, there's some uncertainty around pricing and uptake there. So there's an ebb and flow, and we can't look at just one variable or one metric to try to talk about drug spend. That's where we get into these sort of moments where we're talking past each other, because one player will say, oh, drug spending is going up, and another will respond and say, oh, it's not. Well, we have to look at sort of the different subsets and look at it as part of this broader story.
Thanks. One of the other issues that I think is important to discuss is around, you sort of highlighted the treatment of rare diseases, right? As a piece of this. And we've been working on at CHC and the Campaign for Transformative Therapies, issues surrounding gene therapies. In a lot of cases, they're treating these horrific and expensive conditions. But on the flip side of it, you're looking at, at treatments that may cost millions of dollars per patient. For example, ICER, who you highlighted before, reviewed several of the two hemophilia treatments, both of which are in the range of $2.5 to $3 million per treatment list cost, and found they will in fact deliver value to patients, that they provide really potentially a durable cure for hemophilia, a condition that can cost $700,000 to $800,000 for the most severe patients a year, on top of not on top of the other complications that attach. We expect that sickle cell potentially will have additional gene therapies approved by the end of this year. They're going through their process. Those again will cost in the millions of dollars. And as we look at this as an issue, we've talked. There are a lot of financing issues that are going to attach to a $3 million gene therapy that, from a cost benefit analysis, may have a ROI, a significant return on investment, but, an upfront cost of $3 million. We've had some discussions, and in fact, are running a bill in Wisconsin. And we've got 21 states who have approved what's called a value-based payment arrangement, which requires a state and a drug company to negotiate together and to have a value-based arrangement that shows the effectiveness of the drug. In other words, depending on the contract, they negotiate the access to the drug, and they negotiate the price, and they negotiate rebates, supplemental rebates, if the drug on the drug's effectiveness in treatment. So if it's effective, obviously they've paid it out. If it hasn't been effective for a particular patient or a patient population, as promised, that there may be supplemental rebates that move across. On top of that, I think we're looking at, as we see the potential to have up to 35 gene therapies approved by 2030, that there may be some significant issues from a financing perspective for employers as we look at this, especially employers who may have a child or children that have the condition, may not be the employee themselves, and so something like hemophilia has been very costly, but a $3 million gene therapy is equally costly. There'll be some questions of how those folks get access to the gene therapy and coverage. So those are other issues that I think, as we look going into the future, are going to be major issues for people across the country. We're creating cures functionally for conditions that we never thought we could have, and yet affording these cures is going to be significantly expensive.
Well, and that's why I will echo your point, JP, that I think value-based arrangements are really the way to go in many instances for some of these new gene therapies and other types of therapies for rare diseases. In many ways, those are an underutilized payment mechanism that we should continue to give attention to moving forward.
When we look at these issues, I think especially with particular conditions, one of the things that I think we've seen to the credit of, this is federal, but states are doing work on this as well. They've passed some, they've looked at some legislation, is around clinical trials and diversity in clinical trials and requiring diversity in clinical trials. For example, I think just in the last couple of days, the Wisconsin Attorney General and other attorneys general are suing some manufacturers of blood ox machines because the tracking of people of color for blood oxygen has been poor, and that might have led to increased death during COVID as a piece of it. So certainly there's, I don't know the science behind whether or not there are issues there or not, but certainly that's an issue that is, that from a clinical trial standpoint. But there is also some other issues attaching where it's difficult to deal with. So, diversity in clinical trials may make sense generally, but I think you have to be careful with conditions like sickle cell, which may, disproportionately impact one group versus another. What work have you guys done on this front, Andrew?
Yeah. We are quite active on expanding representation in clinical trials, but frankly, it's something we've been working on for over a decade now. This isn't new. It's sort of just new to a lot of the policy debate, but companies who run clinical trials have been thinking about this for some time. And we like to look at it as a broader question. And that is, how do we get as many people as possible into clinical trials so that we are not drawing from a self-selected and limited pool, usually from people who are connected to academic medical centers? So let me explain that issue a little bit more. Part of the access to clinical trials challenge is that you're more likely to enroll in a clinical trial if you qualify, if you have a physician or other provider who knows about that trial and can communicate to you about that trial. And usually that's based on whether that provider has some sort of relationship where they have an awareness and they're keeping track of what clinical research is taking place. More often than not, that is providers who are connected in some way to an academic medical center. It's very unlikely that someone who is a community-based provider that lives or locates their practice far away from a major academic research center would have the up-to-date understanding of what's happening with clinical trials in the vast scope of therapeutic areas. So one of our proposals that we have taken very seriously for some time is to try to find a way to create a CMS code to reimburse physician-patient conversations about clinical trials. We understand that there is existing support for enrolling those patients, but the first step is actually starting the conversation and finding a way to incentivize those providers to actually talk to patients about clinical trials and take the time to do so is something that we think can go a long way to expanding the scope of representation in clinical research across the board. And we think that this is a critical factor to help expand trials in states and localities without much of a presence of them. So that's a major factor. But we're always looking to see what we can do to expand that scope to make clinical trial enrollment more representative of patient populations as a whole. Now, we don't think that quotas are an effective tactic for doing that, but we do think that having diversity plans as part of the protocol that's going behind the development of a clinical trial is an important part of diversifying those trials themselves. So a number of different strategies, some on the policy side, some inside clinical research organizations, but working together to expand representation.
Great. And on clinical trials, I think you and I discussed this ad nauseum, and we worked earlier this year on an NCOIL model related to healthcare data. Yeah. And I just wanted to highlight what we sort of saw when we worked through that process. So I think one of the issues, as you talk about clinical trials, a number of states are looking to protect, underlying consumer data and are passing fairly broad data privacy laws that attach. But what they're forgetting, I think, is there are a number of federal framework around health law and especially clinical trials that need to be protected and that the ability of a consumer, say, to erase their all of their data that gets accessed creates a really significant problem in a clinical trial criteria.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I think a lot of times you have well-meaning state legislatures who are seeking to protect the data of their constituents, understandably and importantly so, but they don't think about the nuances of how is clinical trial data different? How is it different even than your traditional HIPAA data, other types of healthcare data? And so when they're developing legislation, they really don't typically think about clinical trials until, frankly, we tell them they need to be thinking about clinical trials. So that's something that we have worked on, well, of course, alongside you, JP, over the past year or two, to help frame language in the states so that we are protecting the ability of clinical trials to operate as they have in the past, and not to be restricted by data bills that are unintentionally harming the ability of clinical research to thrive in their particular states.
And I would note as well, Andrew, I think one of the new interesting developments as we go forward, and I'm calling an audible idea that we did not talk about beforehand, but I think had some discussions earlier this morning in some other spots around the use of artificial intelligence in healthcare. I think generally it's interesting. I worked with a company that was looking to apply artificial intelligence to diagnose certain conditions, in this case melanoma, before a doctor could, based on access to medical records. I think in other cases we see, certainly there was one insurer earlier this year that was using artificial intelligence to deal with prior authorizations. And there's a balancing effect that is sort of going on. Those prior authorizations were done in record time, but were not quite as accurate as maybe the company would have hoped up front. But again, it gave the consumer the opportunity to have an answer within a day rather than an answer within a month. But there's going to be a lot of issues surrounding access to data, using that data to make these decisions, and what the sort of implications are and who's responsible as we look at it. So what is IQVIA doing on the data front from that standpoint?
Well, AI is a very timely topic, of course, so I'm glad that you brought it up. So we have a few things going on. One, I would say most of the regulatory or broader policy changes associated with AI in healthcare right now have been in agencies like FDA. So recently, FDA put out some draft guidance about the use of AI in their drug and device approval processes, about the use of AI related to the use of real-world evidence. And we responded to that draft guidance and have continued that conversation with the agency. And I think other companies are doing that at present as well. So we're seeing a lot of talk from FDA. We're also starting to see a little bit federally on Capitol Hill. There are, of course, broader AI conversations going on in both the House and the Senate. But there's a small group of senators. Senator Cassidy on the Health Committee. Health Committee has spent a little bit of time really analyzing the use of AI in healthcare. Senator Schumer is spending some time developing a framework on that. So we're definitely starting to see what's the connection between AI and clinical research and AI and health data on the federal landscape. At the state level, back to our discussion for today, we're not seeing too many of the data bills with AI components to them prior to this year. So it's, if you look at the data privacy bills that passed, starting with the early ones in 2020, 2021, even 2022, mostly absent any language about AI. I've started to notice this year it's popping into the discussion. So I would anticipate, if I'm using the crystal ball for a minute, that any of the new states coming on board with data privacy legislation starting in the next session, 2024 and onward, are going to have some sort of AI component to them.
Yeah, and we've been working on this through insurance, obviously, for some time. The insurance, unlike the other areas, is primarily state regulated. Despite the ignorance in certain cases, as you saw, the NAIC issue a scathing press release earlier this week on President Biden around annuities. but insurance is state regulated, and the NEIC is looking at this, and they actually do have a framework that they're looking at from a bulletin standpoint to sort of understand the issues. I think what's interesting, from their perspective, is the sense that you don't need a new framework attaching. That if you look at it, the use of AI needs to be responsible for under the same insurance rubric as any other tool, as say computers were in the 1970s into the 1980s, as you move from paper to computers in the 70s and 80s, that it's the same sort of rubric. This is a little bit different than the way Colorado's sort of looking at it, but Colorado's
this is a great, this is a great example of where the states need to be talking to industry in their states about how they've already been using AI. We've been using AI and ML in various parts of our clinical research enterprise for many, many years. And I think legislators are starting to catch up to that. But I think some of the self frameworks that companies have developed over time can in some ways be instructive for state health departments, state legislatures, and others who are involved in this now.
And it's important to note that we've all been using AI because you get that little fill in or the auto correct that sometimes it's accurate and sometimes it's inaccurate. So we've been using it for
I have to fight it a lot of the time, JP, because usually I know what I want to say more than it does. Yeah.
All right. I want to highlight since next week we'll be hanging at the National Council of Insurance Legislators. We mentioned that they had done the data privacy resolution, which is available on their website that we worked on. And as part of the health meeting, they've asked you to speak on what's going on drug shortages. So I guess a quick highlight as to what you'll be saying tomorrow. So if folks aren't there, so if folks aren't there, they can know.
Sure. So we were recently a part of a series of roundtable conversations with the White House on drug shortages. There is clearly an interest in responding to shortages from the Biden White House, HHS, and a little bit on Capitol Hill, although I think those efforts are not quite connected yet. But I will say a few things about the shortage issues, just some key observations on the drug shortage environment as understood by some of our institute's recent work. One, the drug shortage problem is highly concentrated in a relatively small number of products that are mostly generics and mostly injectables. Okay, so of the roughly 3,000 specific NDCs with a reported shortage, over 70% of them are still active or planned discontinuations. Okay, and 80% of those shortages are generics or branded generics, right? So that's a significant percentage there to think about. So we're largely talking about generics issue. Over 56% of them are injectable forms. So injectables and generics as you're thinking about this. And not all of these shortages are really significant or dramatically impactful in any way, but they still may count as shortages. I'm often asked what therapeutic areas are seeing products with the most shortages. It's pain drugs, cardio, oncology, and a little bit neurology and infectious disease. Those are the ones that we're seeing. So that's kind of the first thing that I think is worth keeping in mind. Generics, injectables. The term shortage also can have some different meanings. And often the reasons for the reported shortages are generally ambiguous or misleading. So a lot of times we don't necessarily know what that reason may be when we're actually seeing the reporting. Sometimes it is simply increased demand. And sometimes it's an issue with one specific facility. So there are a variety of different factors at work. And I will also say that while a lot of the attention focuses on single-sourced molecules, some of the more impactful recent shortages in oncology, which we've seen a lot of news about, are all multi-source. So, if a manufacturer has a high share and they're impacted, the risk is greater than in a more diversified manufacturer situation. But it is important to get to some root causes of shortages to inform the decision making, which is something that we've been trying to communicate. So in the cancer space, there are about 30 molecules that are reporting an active shortage or a planned discontinuation. And of those 30, 5 drugs represent 92% of the drug volume, and the predominant volume trend is up. And so, we're talking about a small number, but it's important to keep in mind which products those actually are. Another factor to keep in mind is that shortage implies a volume impact. Okay, so for many of the products on the drug shortage list, our measure of the total monthly volume being shipped to that end setting, a hospital, a retail pharmacy, mail order facility, has been steady or has increased over the past 5 years. But shortages are relative to an unknown demand, which could be higher or lower than that base period. So we also have some of these localized shortages, right, that might not be visible nationally, and they might exist just for a particular pharmacy or region of the country, and that's a different thing altogether. So overall, a number of factors, not as alarming as some of the news reports have made you think. It's a relatively, and in fact, highly concentrated in a small number of products. And again, mostly generics, mostly injectables. But hopefully that's helpful by way of an overview.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So if folks do have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll certainly try to answer them if we can. So feel free to put any questions in the chat. I don't know if we've got one just popped up.
So this is asking about UPLs involving mandatory rebates to the state for the difference if a drug price is higher than the UPL. And he's referencing in the IRA, we've seen the federal government divert the law's drug savings from Medicare to fund unrelated government spending like green energy.
Yes.
If so, those funds returned to patients or just added to the state's general revenue. So my understanding is that every state is a little bit different, and we haven't yet seen, since these are all in their early stages, what the excess funding would actually go towards within state budgets. But it's an important question, I think, but it's not one that I'm clear if we have an answer to yet. JP, do you?
Yeah, my understanding, when you deal with Medicaid, mm-hmm. and you're looking at rebates going into Medicaid, I think there's a couple of issues that attach. The money that goes typically into Medicaid through rebate, whatever rebate mechanism that comes through, typically stays in Medicaid, is my understanding. They're not sort of shipped out. Now, certainly, if there is a temporary general fund shortage, if you talk to budget directors, they will utilize funds coming through on a temporary basis to sort of look at that. I think, though, one of the major issues as you look at what's the money going into Medicaid from rebates is it's difficult to track where it goes. In other words, I think Medicaid can use those funds inside Medicaid for other efforts, in part because the rebates may come sometimes significantly after the actual drug spend happens. For example, I think when we dealt with the closing of our state high-risk pool, we had an unexpected $1 million in rebates that came through after about a year after the high-risk pool closed, and we had to figure out how to distribute that money back to the consumers in that case. In the case of Medicaid, I believe it's used inside Medicaid programs, but not necessarily specific to the drug program or the specific program where it was under. So I think it's a great question. I think the tracking there is difficult and complicated, and state budgeting can be interesting. And if you've seen one state budget and one state Medicaid budget, you've seen one state budget and one state Medicaid budget. So I would expect there is at least some states where the tracking is pretty tight, but I know in other states, not so much. Other questions? Let's see. I'm not seeing any other questions. Are you seeing any other questions, Andrew?
I saw one other about the legalities around PBMs, and I don't know if that's asking about potential litigation, but if so, there certainly is. There are a number of legal challenges at the state level. It's unclear how successful those legal challenges will be, particularly in some of these early examples here. I think we've seen some efforts to challenge Colorado's, but it's unclear if those are going to be successful or not. I think most of the states are just moving forward, assuming the states will prevail in those lawsuits.
Yeah, I think you'll have to have a specific drug with a specific impact that before you'll be able to successfully sort of challenge, and you'll have to sort of prove it. I suspect, as well as coming from a former regulator standpoint, in a lot of cases, you can have these discussions off the record. And if you're going to be declared quote unquote unaffordable, there may be a negotiation behind the scenes to an acceptable alternative, which isn't good government by any means. So I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, as a matter of course, it's something that could happen. But the idea that a set price in the state from any purchaser starts getting a little bit more difficult. You can certainly see an argument from a specific purchaser in the individual market. They're obviously in your state. You get to small group, it's likely all of them are in your state. If you go to a large employer, they may have some employees that are physically located outside the state, and that's a fairly common. But the majority of employees are there, and especially if you start looking at in places like Minnesota and Wisconsin. Minnesota has one. There's a significant border that attaches with people going on both sides from a work perspective, and health systems, in fact, crossing both sides from a health perspective. So those issues are going to start getting complicated legally and potentially result in challenges, I think, as they develop, if they can actually get to a point of funding, deciding a drug is unaffordable, and setting an upper payment limit. All that is a significant regulatory sort of problem, and nobody's proven that they're able to get there as yet. So that's the other bit, right?
Yeah. Now, I will say that NASHP, in developing their model, did look to some of the previous challenges on other drug price legislation to see, how could they create this in such a way to avoid some of the legal challenges. So in some ways, they have buffered themselves there. But to JP's point, when we get to specific drugs and specific instances, it's all up for debate at that point.
Yeah, and I will note, if you review the NASHP legislation as well, it's rather imprecise. Yeah. It seems odd to me that they're using the language quote manufacturers as not being a potential member of the group, when in fact, so you can't be affiliated with a manufacturer. It doesn't say drug manufacturer; it says manufacturer, right? And that creates that's a very imprecise sort of model. Which may create other issues as people, look at it down the road. And I'm not seeing any additional questions. Are you?
Hi,
Kelly?
We have one more question.
Please.
The last one that we have time to take. Darren's asking, any thoughts or comments on the potential impact that UPL could have on Medicaid best price?
I think what's going to be interesting on Medicaid, so we've been working on Medicaid best separately. So I'm going to avoid the UPL question and answer a different question, like a good former regulator does. And I think what's going to be interesting is, as we work through, the higher priced issues, these gene therapies, and the value-based payment arrangements, and looking at negotiating, one by one. I think Medicaid's going to be interesting to see how it works. I think our CTT paper on Medicaid on best price, I think it's interesting because there are drug lists, there are other pieces that are there. I will tell you, if you have concerns about the PBM abuses generally, insofar as there are, I think states are probably worse at it than any private entity is. From that standpoint, and the way they sort of operate, or at least some states are, some concerns, meaning the poor incentives. And again, I don't mean to denigrate the PBMs generally, just there are some, potential issues in the way states do drugs, whether they carve them out to MCOs, managed care organizations. So I think drug issues inside Medicaid are complicated. And I would say that if you talk to a MCO that has to deal with the state Medicaid preferred drug lists and how they operate, they might privately indicate some concerns there, and that there, in fact, PBM may have no control over the way this sort of operates and the rules of operation. In other cases, there may be some differences there. So I think there'll be some significant. I think Medicaid is complicated and hard to understand how it works. Well, thank you everybody for being on the webinar today. We appreciate it. We hope we provided good info for you. Andrew, you were spectacular as usual. Appreciate your wisdom and your discussion.
Well, thank you
Thanks
so
for
much,
joining us
JP.
today.
Always enjoy having the chance to speak with you. Look forward to taking any further questions. Find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Happy to chat more about drug pricing in the States.
All right. Thank you, everybody.